Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. This whole mess started about 8 months ago when I finally bought my dream house after years of saving every penny. It's not some fancy mansion, but it's perfect for me. A cozy 2-bedroom place with the most amazing backyard I've ever seen. The real selling point was this massive oak tree that's probably over 100 years old. The thing is absolutely gorgeous, with branches that spread out like an umbrella and provide the most incredible shade. The previous owner was an elderly man who'd lived there for decades and had turned the whole backyard into this amazing garden paradise. When his family put the house on the market after he passed away, I knew I had to have it. I spent the first few weeks just working in the garden, learning about all the different plants and flowers that were already established. It was therapeutic after long days at work, and I was really starting to feel like this place was home. That's when I met my new neighbor. I was out there one Saturday morning pruning some rose bushes when this woman came walking over from the house next door. She looked to be in her 40s, perfectly put together in that aggressive suburban mom way. She introduced herself as my new neighbor and said she'd just moved in with her husband and 2 kids. The conversation started out normal enough. She complimented the garden and told me how she'd always admired it from across the fence. Then she said something that should have been a red flag, but at the time I thought it was just a sweet comment about the previous owner. She pointed at the oak tree and said it was wonderful to see the old family tree again. She mentioned that her great-uncle had always said this tree had the best shade in the whole county. I figured she was just being sentimental about the old man who used to live here, so I smiled and agreed that it really was a beautiful tree. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the way she said family tree. About a week later, I came home from work around 6 in the evening to find the most bizarre scene in my backyard. There was a full picnic happening under my oak tree. This woman, her husband, and their 2 kids had spread out a blanket, set up a cooler, and were eating dinner on my lawn like it was a public park. The kids had toys scattered everywhere, and they all looked completely comfortable, like they belonged there. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I was seeing things correctly. Then I walked over and politely told them I thought there might be some misunderstanding, since this was my private property. The woman didn't even look embarrassed. She just waved her hand dismissively and told me not to be silly, that they were family. She said the previous owner had always wanted them to enjoy this land and that he would be horrified if he knew I was trying to keep them out. I explained again that this was my yard, that I owned the entire property, and asked them to please pack up their things. That's when she really showed her true colors. She got this condescending tone and started talking about how a verbal family promise of land use was a time-honored tradition. She claimed it was practically common law, and that the piece of paper I had from the bank didn't erase generations of family history. I was stunned. I'd never heard such complete nonsense in my life. I told them firmly that they needed to leave, and eventually they did pack up their stuff. But the woman made sure to sigh dramatically and mutter loudly about rude newcomers with no respect for family as they gathered their things. That should have been the end of it, but it was really just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the harassment started small. I'd come home to find that she'd been using my outdoor water spigot to water her plants. Her overflowing trash bins would mysteriously end up on my property. Her dog was constantly loose in my yard, leaving presents all over my carefully maintained lawn. Every time I confronted her about these things, she'd act like I was being unreasonable. She'd make comments about how neighbors should help each other out, or how I was being petty over such small things. Then things escalated. I discovered one morning that someone had tilled up a section of my flower garden and planted vegetables there. When I knocked on her door to ask about it, she actually had the nerve to tell me she was improving the land. She smugly mentioned something about squatters' rights beginning with land improvement, like she knew what she was talking about. At this point, I was getting really frustrated, but it got worse. She started telling other neighbors that I was some kind of greedy corporate type who had stolen the land from a grieving family. She painted herself as the victim, saying I was bullying them and trying to keep them away from their ancestral property. I could feel some of the other neighbors starting to look at me differently. A few people who had been friendly when I first moved in became more distant. It was clear she was spreading lies about me, and it was working. The final straw came when I realized I was going to have to build a fence. I didn't want to be that neighbor, but I couldn't live like this anymore. I did everything completely by the book. I hired a professional surveyor to come out and mark the exact property lines. I got all the necessary permits from the city. I even wrote her a polite letter explaining that construction would begin on a specific date, just as a courtesy. Her reaction was nuclear. When the surveyor showed up, she tried to physically block him from doing his job. She stood in front of his equipment and screamed that he was trespassing on her family's land. The poor guy didn't know what to do. On the day the fence installation was supposed to start, she completely lost her mind. She positioned herself in front of the post hole digger and refused to move. She was screaming about how I was destroying her ancestral property and that she'd never let me get away with this. Then she called the police, claiming I was vandalizing her land. When the officers arrived, I was ready for them. I calmly presented my deed to the house, the official survey report with clearly marked boundaries, and the city-issued permit for the fence. The police reviewed everything and told her in no uncertain terms that this was my property and she was trespassing. They warned her that if she continued to interfere with the construction, she would be arrested. She finally backed off, but I could see in her eyes that this wasn't over. That night, I made a decision that would turn out to be the smartest thing I did in this whole situation. I installed high-quality security cameras covering the entire property line. Those cameras caught everything over the next few weeks. They recorded her throwing bags of dog waste over my newly completed fence. They caught her trying to spray what looked like weed killer on my flower beds near the fence line. They filmed her screaming insults at the cameras themselves like she was losing touch with reality. I took all this video evidence to a property lawyer. After reviewing everything, he sent her a formal cease and desist letter demanding that she stop harassing me and stay off my property. The cameras caught her response to that letter too. She marched right up to one of the cameras, tore the letter into pieces, and shouted that my lawyer's letters meant nothing because this was her land. That's when my lawyer made a discovery that changed everything. While we were going over the official survey documents, he noticed something interesting. According to the survey, a 2-foot wide strip of land that had been incorporated into her driveway for decades was actually on my side of the property line. The previous owners of her house had apparently paved over this strip and used it as part of their driveway. The old owner of my house had probably allowed it as a friendly gesture between neighbors, but no formal easement had ever been recorded. This meant that the only way for her to get her car to her garage was by driving over a 2-foot strip of my land. Every time she used her driveway, she was technically trespassing. My lawyer smiled when he realized this. He drafted a new letter that was much more powerful than the first one. The letter informed her that her driveway was encroaching on my property and that she was legally trespassing every time she used it. It gave her 30 days to remove the encroaching section of her driveway at her own expense. As an alternative, it offered to lease her the 2-foot strip of land for $500 per month. The beauty of this situation was that she was completely trapped. She couldn't use her garage without crossing my land. The value of her house would plummet because she'd have to disclose this major legal issue to any potential buyers. All her pseudo-legal arguments about family rights and ancestral property were useless against a certified survey map. The very piece of paper she'd mocked when she first moved in had become her prison. About a week after she received the letter, there was a knock on my door. It wasn't her this time. It was her husband. He looked completely defeated, like a man who'd been worn down by months of his wife's crusade. He asked if we could talk, and I could tell he was embarrassed by the whole situation. He explained that they were stuck and asked if there was any way we could work something out. I'd been thinking about this moment for weeks, and I knew exactly what I wanted. I told him I was willing to grant them a permanent legal easement for the driveway, but only if they agreed to my conditions. The conditions would be legally binding, and there would be no room for interpretation later. First, I wanted a full written apology from his wife for the months of harassment. The apology had to explicitly acknowledge my sole and undisputed ownership of the house and yard. Second, they had to reimburse me for all my lawyer fees and the cost of the survey. Third, they had to agree to a legally binding no contact and no trespass order. This would prevent them from ever setting foot on my property or speaking to me again without invitation. Finally, they would pay me exactly $1 for the easement. This wasn't about money. It was about making it crystal clear that this had never been their land, and that they were getting access to my property only because I was choosing to allow it. The husband nodded along to everything I said. He knew these terms were more than fair, considering the alternative was his wife having to tear up their driveway and not being able to use their garage. It took another week of negotiations, but eventually they agreed to everything. The wife was furious about having to write the apology letter, but she didn't have a choice. They paid the legal fees, signed all the agreements, and handed over their dollar. That was 3 months ago, and the difference in my life has been incredible. The harassment stopped completely. She can't even look in my direction now without risking violation of the no contact order. When she gets out of her car, she has to studiously ignore me and my yard, and I can see how much it kills her. I spend my evenings relaxing under that beautiful oak tree, working in my garden in complete peace. The fence is sturdy and well built, and my security cameras are still recording everything, just in case. The best part is that this whole ordeal actually brought me closer to some of the other neighbors. Once the truth came out about what had really been happening, several people apologized for believing her lies. They'd realized she was the problem neighbor, not me. Looking back, I'm almost glad this happened. It was stressful at the time, but learning to stand up for myself and use the proper legal channels to solve problems was valuable. The satisfaction of watching an entitled bully get defeated by simple facts and property law was worth every penny I spent on lawyers and surveyors. My house truly feels like home now, and I know that my property rights are protected. Sometimes you have to fight for what's yours, but when you do it the right way, with documentation and legal backing, justice really does prevail. The woman still lives next door, but she might as well be invisible now. Every time I see her carefully avoiding eye contact as she walks from her car to her front door, I'm reminded that bullies only have power when you let them. Once you stand up to them with facts and the law on your side, they usually crumble pretty quickly. I'm planning to expand my garden this spring, maybe add some new flower beds near the fence line. After all, it's my property and I can do whatever I want with it. Update. 6 months later, and the drama isn't quite over. I thought my story was finished, but life had other plans. A lot of people asked for an update, and boy do I have one for you. Remember how I mentioned that the entitled neighbor couldn't even look at me anymore? Well, that lasted about 4 months before she found a new way to make my life difficult. It started when I decided to follow through on my plan to expand the garden. I hired a landscaping company to install some new flower beds and a small decorative pond near the back corner of my yard. Everything was going perfectly until the third day of construction. I came home from work to find 2 city inspectors in my backyard, measuring and taking photos. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint claiming I was building structures too close to the property line and potentially damaging the root system of that beautiful oak tree. The inspectors were actually really nice about it. They showed me the complaint form, and while the name was redacted, it was pretty obvious who had filed it. The complaint claimed I was destroying historic landscaping and potentially damaging a tree that was supposedly protected by some made-up historic preservation ordinance. I pulled out my permits and showed them that everything was well within legal limits. The landscaping company had done their homework and made sure we weren't violating any actual regulations. The inspectors looked over everything, took some measurements, and confirmed that there were no violations. But here's where it gets interesting. One of the inspectors mentioned that this was the 3rd complaint they'd received about my property in the past month. Someone had also reported me for having an illegal fence and for supposedly running a business out of my home. All the complaints were completely baseless, but they were clearly part of a pattern of harassment designed to waste city resources and make my life difficult. The inspector actually looked embarrassed when he told me about it, and he suggested I might want to document the pattern in case it continued. That evening, I called my lawyer again. He wasn't surprised to hear from me, and when I explained the situation, he immediately knew what we needed to do. The next morning, we filed a formal harassment complaint with the city against my neighbor. We included documentation of the original property dispute, copies of the frivolous complaints she'd been filing, and evidence that she was deliberately misusing city services to harass me. But the real bombshell came 2 days later. I was working in my garden when I noticed a man with a clipboard walking around my neighbor's backyard. He was measuring things and taking photos, just like the city inspectors had done. I didn't think much of it until my other neighbor mentioned that there was a surveyor working next door. That got my attention. Why would they need a surveyor? I found out the answer the next week when my lawyer called me with some very interesting news. Apparently, my entitled neighbor had hired her own surveyor to try to dispute the original property lines. She was convinced that the survey I'd paid for was wrong and that she could prove her driveway was actually on her own land. Her surveyor's report came back with the exact same measurements as mine. The 2-foot strip was definitely on my property, and there was no way around it. But here's where her entitlement reached new heights. Instead of accepting reality, she filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I had somehow falsified the original survey and that she was the victim of fraud. My lawyer was actually excited when he told me about the lawsuit. He explained that this was exactly the kind of frivolous legal action that could result in serious consequences for her, including having to pay all my legal fees and potentially facing sanctions from the court. The lawsuit was completely ridiculous. She was essentially arguing that 2 different professional surveyors had conspired with me to falsify property records, and that the city had issued permits based on fraudulent information. She had no evidence to support any of these claims. My lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, along with a counterclaim for malicious prosecution and harassment. We also requested that the court impose sanctions on her for filing a frivolous lawsuit. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and I have to admit I was nervous. Even though I knew I was in the right, being sued is stressful no matter what. I needn't have worried. The judge took one look at the evidence and was clearly not impressed with my neighbor's case. She had no documentation to support her claims, no expert testimony to contradict the surveys, and no legal basis for arguing that established property lines were somehow fraudulent. When her lawyer tried to argue that there was some kind of conspiracy against his client, the judge actually interrupted him and asked if he was seriously suggesting that 2 independent surveyors and the city planning department had all collaborated to defraud one homeowner. The lawyer couldn't answer that question because the whole premise was obviously absurd. The judge dismissed her lawsuit and granted my counterclaim, but the real satisfaction came when he addressed her directly from the bench. He told her that filing frivolous lawsuits wastes court resources and constitutes harassment of other citizens. He imposed sanctions requiring her to pay all my legal fees from both the original property dispute and this new lawsuit. The total came to just over $8,000. But he wasn't done. He also issued a formal restraining order preventing her from filing any future legal actions against me without first getting permission from the court. Essentially, if she wants to sue me again, she has to convince a judge that she has a legitimate case before she's even allowed to file. The look on her face when the judge read that ruling was absolutely priceless. She'd gone from thinking she could intimidate me with a lawsuit to being ordered to pay thousands of dollars and having her ability to file future lawsuits restricted. Outside the courthouse, her husband approached me again. He looked even more defeated than the first time we'd talked. He apologized profusely and promised that there wouldn't be any more problems. I told him I hoped that was true, but that I'd be ready if it wasn't. That was 2 months ago, and things have been completely quiet since then. No more frivolous complaints to the city, no more harassment, no more legal drama. My neighbor has to walk from her car to her front door knowing that she owes me $8,000 and that any future harassment could land her in serious legal trouble. The landscaping project was completed without any further interference, and my backyard looks absolutely amazing now. The new flower beds are thriving, and the small pond has become a favorite spot for local birds. I've even started hosting small garden parties for some of the neighbors who supported me through this whole ordeal. The best part is that property values in the neighborhood have actually gone up since all this drama ended. It turns out that having a resident who constantly files frivolous complaints and harasses neighbors is bad for everyone's home values. Now that she's been legally muzzled, the whole street is more peaceful. I've learned a lot from this experience. The most important lesson is that bullies often escalate their behavior when their initial tactics don't work. If I hadn't documented everything and worked with a good lawyer, she might have been able to cause much more damage with her false complaints and frivolous lawsuit. I've also learned that standing up to entitled people sometimes requires patience and persistence. This whole saga took almost a year to fully resolve, but the end result was worth it. Not only did I protect my property rights, but I also ensured that she can't easily harass me or anyone else in the future. My security cameras are still recording everything, and I keep all my legal documents organized and easily accessible. I hope I never need them again, but I'm prepared if I do. The oak tree that started this whole mess is more beautiful than ever. I had an arborist come out to check on it after all the construction, and he said it's in perfect health. Sometimes I sit under it in the evening and think about how this all began with a simple misunderstanding about property lines. My neighbor still lives next door, but she's like a ghost now. I rarely see her, and when I do, she quickly looks away and hurries inside. Her husband occasionally waves from a distance, and I can tell he's embarrassed by everything that happened. The $8,000 she owes me is being paid off in monthly installments as ordered by the court. Every month I get a check in the mail as a reminder that actions have consequences and that the legal system works when you use it properly. I'm planning to use that money to make even more improvements to my garden. Maybe I'll add a gazebo near the oak tree or install some decorative lighting for evening entertaining. After all, it's my property, and thanks to the legal system, everyone knows exactly where the boundaries are. The whole experience has actually made me a better neighbor to everyone else on the street. I've gotten to know several people who offered support during the worst of the harassment, and we've formed a nice little community. We look out for each other now, and I think we're all more aware of how important it is to respect property rights and treat each other with basic decency. If there's one thing I want people to take away from this story, it's that you don't have to put up with harassment from entitled neighbors. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to use the legal system when necessary. It might take time and cost money up front, but protecting your peace of mind and your property rights is worth it in the end. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice is served with a side of poetic irony. The woman who claimed my legal documents were just worthless pieces of paper ended up losing $8,000 because of the legal documents that proved she was wrong. The next one is a pro-revenge story. I've wanted to post this tale here for a long time. I've started the post many times, walking away from the computer and giving up each time. Note that like many tales here, many trivial to the story details have been changed. What is important to note is that the way my industry runs is essentially via monthly service contracts with clients. There are three major players in the story: myself, Egnards, old owner, let's call him Steve, and new owner, let's call him Kyle. Act 1. Do what you love. As an aimless teenager, I started working for a small business owned by Steve. It turns out I really enjoyed what I did, so slowly over time my life plans shifted to make sure I could continue to work for Steve for the long term. This included transferring to a local college, and because the business was predominantly run on part-time hours, making sure that any other jobs I had never conflicted with the hours I was expected to work for Steve. Steve was flawed, but overall a good boss who mostly looked out for me. I certainly think over the years he had taken advantage of me in small ways, but looking back I really have no complaints. The thing is that while when I started working for Steve, the business name recognition was always directed towards Steve. Over the years it eventually became, go to Egnards, he's the best. This got to the point where I do indeed truly believe that if I did not end up working for Steve, it's very likely his business would have been nowhere near as successful as it eventually became. As years went on, it was heavily implied that when Steve retired, the business would go to me. It was never specifically stated, but Steve did have a way about skirting around those types of issues and giving me hope. Act 2. Enter Kyle. About 3 years before COVID, Steve decided to retire and sell his business. He did indeed fulfill his promise by making a half-assed attempt to sell it to me at an unreasonable price. But it was very clear he already had another buyer in mind, Kyle. Kyle owned another local business just outside of our market area in the same industry. Because of the way the industry worked, there really was much, if any, overlap in potential customers. But Kyle had a very large amount of money and was willing to buy. What is important to note here is that, again, I do truly believe that if I didn't play ball and agree to work for Kyle, my role was so integral to operation at our business that there is no possible way a sale could go through. Over the course of negotiations, Kyle ended up buying the business and putting me in charge of running the day-to-day, something I was mostly already doing, but with a few more administrative tasks tacked onto it. The thing is, my name was still the name in town, and Kyle made zero effort to ever be on location, so nobody that did business with us ever really knew who Kyle was. Act 3. Kyle's kind of a dick, and how I learned to stand up for myself. All was well for a while. Kyle would openly talk about me being the head honcho at my location, and mostly left me alone to deal with my clients in the professional and personable nature that I had learned from Steve. Things first came to a head a year before COVID when Kyle sent me to an industry conference for 4 days. I would need to take off time from my other job, which I was fine with. At the conclusion of the conference, I put in an hour's request for the hours I spent at the conference, and I was super nice about it. Actually, I should have clocked all hours at the convention each day, but instead did not account for hours for seminars that would help my boss but were ones I had wanted to attend. The request was denied, and I was told, industry conferences are enriching activities, we pay for your admission, but they're on your own time. This took 2 weeks to resolve, but ended with me essentially saying, look, I'll still work for you because I love what I do. However, if I don't get paid, I will never go to another one of these conferences again to get new ideas for you. I was immediately paid. I will spare similar smaller stories of that nature, but that slowly started to become the relationship between Kyle and I. Act 4. COVID hits. When COVID hit, our locations were shut down, and for 3 weeks we weren't able to do anything. Meanwhile, our clients were still paying for services, and because Kyle had recently moved to a new client payment portal that I hadn't been trained on yet, I wasn't able to help any clients get their money back. At one point, I messaged Kyle about going virtual and being able to still assist clients, and got a very angry text back, full of curses, that essentially said, look, you're not the boss, go duck yourself, you had your chance to be the owner and turned it down. I'm in charge. We did eventually go virtual about a week later. The big problem, of course, being that I would receive daily texts / emails / calls from clients about their memberships, bills, and there was nothing I could do to help them. It was at this point that I knew crap was hitting the fan, and I needed to start doing something. So over the course of the next 2 months, I did a couple things. Spent an inordinate amount of time studying the best business structures, communicated with all of the other staff at my location about my intentions, continued to give 110% to my clients in a virtual capacity, built a website and social media presence from the ground up. I don't think Kyle was expecting any of this, and he probably didn't also realize that because I often had to do back-end stuff from home, I also had what was essentially a little black book of every client, their email addresses and phone numbers. Act 5. Surgical strikes. When everything was ready, I waited very patiently only the end of a service month. As I mentioned, all of our clients had monthly costs, and I didn't want to put anyone out of any part of their costs. On the last weekday of the month, I instructed the staff who would be helping clients that day to tell them to check their emails at the end of the day. At the end of the day, I sent out an email to all active and some non-active clients, as well as a texting service to text everybody. I launched our social media accounts, our website, and had even enlisted a very small amount of trusted clients to spread the word via social media once I gave them the signal. Within 15 minutes of everything, my phone was ringing off the hook. I had 50 plus emails in my inbox from different people, and my Facebook accounts were completely blowing up with local chatter. I also heard from many of these people that they were calling Kyle to cancel their service. We hosted a Zoom meeting for all concerned parties and essentially decided to take the weekend to clear up any confusion with the systems and start fresh and open our doors on Monday. Within an hour of everything, Kyle sent out a text blast to every client that they would be shutting their doors effective immediately. At the start of COVID, we had roughly 50 active clients at the business. On my first day of business, I had signed up 75 active clients, many inactive ones telling me, yeah, we stopped doing business with you guys because Kyle was kind of a dick. What is really important to keep in mind here is that I never wanted to, nor cared to be, a business owner. I was very happy working for somebody else as long as I wasn't treated like crap. Had Kyle treated me even remotely better, the location would have continued to thrive and be a staple in our local community. Kyle chose to be a dick to try and get quick money and cheat people, and Kyle lost out. We've been in business now almost 2 years, have nearly tripled Kyle's active numbers, and continue to be a staple in our community. The next one is an entitled people story, so I made a previous post about my stepmom trying to ride my scooter without my permission, and this happened a few days later when I took the scooter for a test run to work and back home. I had just gotten home and there was still about 3 hours of sunlight left, so I decided to do a test run with my scooter by riding it to my workplace. Then coming back home. Simple, right? Sorta, because people get huffy and puffy about biking or scooters being on the sidewalk, I decided to ride my scooter in the parking lane and keeping my eye on traffic, as well as crossing the road and staying within speed limit 30 miles per hour, while my scooter's max speed was 15 miles per hour. I was getting ready to cross the road to the other side and check both sides of the street. There was a car but several feet away, so I kicked off and crossed to the other side. The driver had seen me and slowed down slightly to allow me to fully get across safely. But the car following not far behind them honked as they passed by me and stuck their hand out the window, flipping me the bird. Again, I'm in the parking lane right next to the curb and not weaving in and out of traffic or disturbing traffic in anyways. I'm just thinking, WTF is your problem, and just ignore the driver because I wasn't trying to start anything or wanted them to turn around to hit me with their car. The rest of the ride to my workplace was pretty smooth besides me making a sharp turn and bumping the curb with the front tire, resulting in me falling into a grassy patch. Luckily, after I arrived at my workplace, 2 random teenagers walked by and the second asked if he could have a ride on my scooter. Of course I said no, and he kept pressing to ride it until I pointed out the camera facing outwards and my co-workers who had clear view of what was happening. Eventually, the first teenager talked his friend into leaving me alone, and I quickly started up my scooter to head back home. Luckily, I wasn't followed and immediately put my scooter away for the night. Anyway, thank you for watching.